semiconductors, small computer chips the size of a fingerprint that power everything, from cell phones to automobiles and so much more. These chips were invented in America. Let's get that straight. They were invented in America. We used to make 40% of the world's chips.
So President Biden is committed to containing China, especially in semiconductors. This is the next frontier of the economic war we must talk about, and the US is getting very desperate. Biden is telling his G7 allies to stop selling chips and technology to China. He's demanding the Netherlands and Japan halt exports to Beijing. But this is simply crazy. 50% of Japan's exports of chip makers are sold directly to China. If Tokyo plays ball with the US and they bow down, they will destroy the earnings of many Japanese companies. Japan's economy is already contracting, the yen is collapsing, and people's standard of living is also dropping. Decoupling with China is the last thing Japan needs. And this is why the US is facing tremendous pushback from the Japanese. Companies like Tokyo Electron needs Chinese money to keep flowing, and here's how dependent they are. China makes up almost half of their entire revenue. If Japan bows down to the US, they will destroy their own semiconductor industry. Sure, China will get hurt as well, but they have the money, they have the time, and the resources to innovate ahead. Japan doesn't. Manufacturing in Japan is already ultra expensive. They can't afford to lose this head start. It's all over if China catches up and they are on Beijing's naughty list. And that's why Raimondo's, the Commerce Secretary's latest plan failed. She told Japan to restrict the export of technology to China, but what came of it was a very diluted agreement. Instead of export bans, the US just got vague commitments. Japan and South Korea agreed to help America's supply chain and semiconductor industries, but that's as far as it went. It's very vague. It's very obvious Japan can't cut trade with China, and there are limits to how far Washington can push their allies. Countries are beginning to realize how dangerous US foreign policy can really be.
Huawei's new smartphone that was released a couple of months ago to know
when
that
I was in China.
Yes. Oh, look at that.
Thank you very much. We have to get smarter about what are the technologies which are just where we are ahead of China. They're capable of doing very bad things, and we're going to deny the entire country this class of equipment. Is industry on board? I mean, yes, but they're in the business of making money. Every time I take an action, it denies them revenue. My own view is that industry, newsflash, democracy is good for your businesses. Rule of law here and around the world is good for your businesses. So it might make for a tough quarterly shareholder call, but in the long run, it's worth you working with us to defend our country's national security.
As you heard from Raimondo, every time the US takes an action, companies are denied revenue. The US wants to cut off Japan's income from China for their own geopolitical objectives. But there's quite a lot of hypocrisy going on here. If we look at China's chip-making imports, the majority of them comes from US allies, especially Japan. In April alone, Tokyo supplied China with $1 billion worth of chip makers, but US companies themselves supplied $500 million to Beijing. This is the same amount as the Netherlands, so there's a very big double standard here. It's the reason why US allies are hitting back, especially Japan. It's important to understand Biden's big plan to reshore chip production back to the US, and this means chips made in America is the priority, not chips made in Taiwan or Japan. Production on US soil is the main agenda here. Now, while the West likes to say China has unfair subsidies, the numbers show that the US is doing the exact same thing. They are flooding their industry with tons of cash. The CHIPS Act gives US companies access to over $100 billion in loans. The amount of subsidies here is simply breathtaking. Intel, for example, received almost $20 billion in grants and loans. Other chip companies in the US also receive billions in subsidies to get ahead of the curve. The US telling their allies to cut Beijing away is detrimental. It's in effect destroying their domestic semiconductor industry. And if you lose China as a customer, how are you going to replace 50% of your revenue? And if revenue goes down, it will be harder for companies to innovate further. Research and development will be near impossible. And this is just one problem. Another issue is China's control of rare earth commodities, and these are needed for semiconductor production and in the machines as well, the chip makers. And here's a reality check: China controls more or less the entire supply chain. Together with Russia, they control almost 50% of the world's rare earth reserves. Conversely, the G7 nations have less than 5% of the rare earth supply, and that is counting in Australia as well. Considering Brazil and Vietnam are closer to China, Japan faces disaster if they enter a trade war with China. The BRICS nations control the raw materials needed for semiconductors. Japan's manufacturing is already on the back foot. If China decides to cut away their supply to Tokyo to punish them, it's game over for their chip industry. And here's how serious this is. Here's why Japan has drawn the red line against US chip sanctions on China. In 2022, China exported 5,300 tons of rare earth metals, 93% of the world's total supply. And that's just in the first 8 months. A huge amount ends up in Japan, around 3,800 tons. 71% of Japan's rare earths comes from China. Good luck trying to replace that. Even if Japan manages to squeeze supply from other countries like Australia, the prices will be crazy. Chip making in Japan will be so expensive that making a profit will be quite impossible. This economic war is all about supply chains. It's something the G7 can't compete against. All the promises and alliances won't change things overnight. It will take decades at the very least. It will require an unthinkable amount of money to rewire global supply chains. And this is evident when we look at what Japanese companies are doing. Just like in Germany, there's a big disconnect between the businessmen and politicians, and the same goes for Japan. The car giant Toyota is looking to build their first EV factory in Shanghai. They have seen the success Tesla is having making their cars in China, and they want in. Tokyo wants their own gigafactory with 100% ownership and tax breaks. They want to build their own Lexus EVs in China. And just sit back and process what I just said. Toyota would rather build their cars in China, a US adversary, than in their own country. Wasn't Japan supposed to be a global manufacturing hub? Isn't the collapsing yen great for companies and industrial exports? Well, apparently not. And if it were, Toyota would be making cars in Tokyo and not Shanghai. There's a reason why Volkswagen, Mercedes, and Tesla they are building their cars in China. Selling in China is extremely competitive today. Since 2020, local Chinese brands in black have been eating up market share. They now own 53% of the entire domestic market. Over the last 15 years, the market share of Japanese cars has collapsed. It went from 31% down to only 15%. It's impossible to compete unless you make your cars in China itself, especially if they are EVs. And to make an EV, you need tons of energy, you need lots of aluminum. Most importantly, you need batteries, and all these are made in China at very low prices. And it's no surprise why Toyota needs a plant in Shanghai. The Chinese market is one thing, the rest of Asia is another. Because Chinese EVs are so affordable, they are flooding into the entire region. Take Thailand for example. Japanese companies have a strong foothold in the country. It's almost a monopoly. The Thai market buys nearly 1 million vehicles a year, so it isn't small, and Japanese companies like Toyota have the lion's share. But in just 1 year, Chinese brands have grown from 4.7% to over 10% of the entire Thai market, and it's thanks to their cheap EVs. Unless Japan can make a cheaper and better electric car, their market share will continue to erode year after year. And this brings us back to the harsh reality. Japan can't afford to decouple with China's economy, not when it comes to EVs, and definitely not when it comes to semiconductors. And let's circle back to the chip wars. Japan is lagging behind the world. They are the third biggest manufacturer in the world, but just look at the amount of chips they sell. The global chip market is around $600 billion strong. Japan's share is only 50 billion, less than 10%. Kishida is trying to reverse that by pouring in tons of money. The total bill will hit over $60 billion, but there's still a fundamental problem with this. Japan is bringing in companies like Micron, TSMC to build more legacy chips. These are semiconductors needed for smartphones, planes, and electronics, but they are also trying to develop next generation chips. Japan wants to produce 2 nanometers by 2027, so it's only 2 to 3 years away. That's what a subsidy for Rapidus, a local company, is all about. Now that sounds nice and dandy until you realize they need more advanced chip making tools, lithography machines that have to get better. And where does this tech come from? Gear makers like Tokyo Electron. R&D isn't cheap. You need to pour in tens of billions of dollars a year and hire scientists to work on the next breakthrough. The money can't be interrupted. Energy costs in Japan are already incredibly high. In December last year, China accounted for 55% of Japan's chip gear makers' revenues. One single country controls the entire balance sheet of Japan's semiconductor makers industry. That is crazy. Even Japan has limits when it comes to US sanctions now. If they stop exports to China tomorrow, the entire chip industry will collapse in a hurry. They won't be able to generate enough profits to develop new and better chips. This is the reality that the G7 faces, not just Japan but the Netherlands, Germany, and France as well. A ton of the trade and industries are interconnected with China, and ironically, this kind of sanction proves Beijing against US punishments. Now, can Japan just go crazy and ban all gear exports to China? Yes, but there will be terrible repercussions, consequences. They will torpedo their own semiconductor industry. It won't really destroy China's progress, at the most, it will delay it. The big winner here, ironically, will be the US. Japanese manufacturing will get hollowed out and they'll move all the way to America. And this sounds quite a bit like Germany, doesn't it? But let me know what you think. Will Japan follow US sanctions to the grave? Or will they protect their own chip industry and still trade with China? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.